The pair of jade bracelets on Madame Li's wrists are of excellent quality. Such luxurious items are surely only fit for someone of noble status. The voice of Empress Yang Yuchen rang in my ears, sending a shiver down my spine. Before I could react, I was shoved hard on the shoulder. Turning my head, I saw my husband, Li Xingyan, frowning deeply as he scolded me loudly. "The Empress is speaking to you, are you deaf? You're just an orphan girl. How could you possibly be worthy of such a fine pair of bracelets? You're wasting a good thing. Take them off immediately and present them to Her Majesty. The Empress is of noble birth and pure character. It is the good fortune of these bracelets to be worn upon her wrists. This is the husband I exhausted everything to save in my past life." I looked closely at his features. He was handsome and striking, otherwise, the Empress wouldn't have remembered their childhood bond from all those years ago. Yet, whenever he faced me, his expression was always dark and cold, showing not a trace of the compassionate look he had when he saved my life by the stream so many years ago. Perhaps because I had been staring at Li Xingyan in silence for too long, Yang Yuchen, seated at the head of the room, let out 2 light coughs. Her voice, a raspy smoker's throat that even 10 pounds of chili peppers a day couldn't produce, strained to squeeze out a girlish, coquettish tone. "Never mind, a gentleman does not take what others love. Physician Li, I was merely offering a casual word of praise. There was no need for you to take my words so much to heart. Madame Li is your wife, after all. You two should strive for marital harmony. Madame Li, do not take it to heart either. Physician Li and I grew up together like siblings. It would be a shame if you let jealousy damage your relationship." It was the exact same rhetoric as in my past life. The next step would be for Li Xingyan to kick me squarely in my unhealed knees and begin raining blows upon me. I looked up, and sure enough, Li Xingyan was already poised to raise his foot. I decisively extended my snow-white wrists, revealing a pair of flawless emerald-green jade bracelets. "Since Her Majesty likes them so much and my husband is so eager to present a gift at another's expense," I said, "even though these are the only relics left by my parents, please, husband, take them off and gift them to Her Majesty." Yang Yuchen's expression soured slightly, and she said with a pout, "It's not that I insist on having your jade bracelets. It's just that Imperial Physician Li also felt these bracelets deserved to be worn by someone more noble, which is why he wanted to give them to me. She wants my things yet insists on maintaining her reputation as someone as indifferent as a chrysanthemum, above all worldly competition. How could things be so convenient?" I sneered inwardly, my peripheral vision sweeping over the gathered palace maids and eunuchs, while tears already began to stream down my face. Li Xingyan, however, couldn't care less about any of that. He only knew that Yang Yuchen wanted the bracelets. He used brute force to wrench them from my wrist, ignoring the dark bruises his rough handling left on my skin. He simply held them reverently in his palms, presenting them to Yang Yuchen to claim credit. "Your Majesty, it is the good fortune of these jade bracelets to be favored by you. May they remain by your side and protect you from the harm of treacherous people. Imperial Physician Li, since you insist on presenting these bracelets to me, I cannot bear to let your kind intentions go to waste. You shall put them on for me." Yang Yuchen extended her short, pudgy hand, adorned with old-fashioned nail guards. Her eyes swept over me, her smugness impossible to conceal. Li Xingyan exerted every ounce of his strength before he finally managed to force the jade bracelet over Yang Yuchen's short, pudgy hand, squeezing it into the flesh of her wrist. I, however, remained indifferent. In fact, seeing both jade bracelets securely settled on Yang Yuchen's wrists, I breathed a secret sigh of relief, and my body felt significantly lighter. Watching them gaze at each other with such tender affection, I counted the time in my head. The moment a flash of bright yellow appeared in the corner of my eye, my body swayed, and I collapsed to the ground. "What is going on here?" A majestic voice rang out, followed instantly by the sound of everyone dropping to their knees. The only palace maid who came to support me held me up carefully, looking at my knees with concern. "How does your Majesty have the time to visit me? Aren't you afraid of making concubine Li jealous?" Amidst the crowd of people kneeling on the ground, Yang Yuchen tilted her chin up and pouted, striking a haughty pose. The emperor was choked up by her words, but he held some genuine affection for Yang Yuchen, so he didn't lose his temper. Instead, he ignored her remark and looked toward me. Who is this? Why did she look as if she couldn't stand steady just now? Li Xingyan, seemingly afraid that I might say the wrong thing and jeopardize his empress, rushed to speak, reporting to your majesty, this is my wife. She is but a lowly orphan girl. There is no need to mind her. I will have her return home immediately. So Physician Li is here as well. It seems Physician Li not only accompanies the Empress at night but doesn't miss a beat during the day either. You are proving to be more devoted than I, the Emperor. Because of Li Xingyan's interruption, the Emperor noticed him, and his expression turned cold. Upon hearing this, the Empress let out a cold snort and refused to back down, saying, Your Majesty is so busy accompanying concubine Li that you seem possessed. I merely summoned Imperial Physician Li for a routine health check. For your majesty to misunderstand me so, I am left without a way to defend myself. You. The emperor, enraged by Yang Yuchen calling him possessed in front of everyone, turned flush with anger. He raised his hand and delivered a sharp slap to Yang Yuchen's face, sending her tumbling to the ground. How is my favoring of a concubine akin to being possessed? It is you, Empress, who acts without decorum, meeting a man outside the family at night. Do you truly think you can get away with it just because I haven't pursued the matter yet? Seeing Yang Yuchen struck to the ground, Li Xingyan was filled with immense heartache. However, fearing that stepping forward to shield her would only add fuel to the fire, his gaze fell upon me. As if struck by a brilliant idea, he shouted with an excited tone, Your Majesty, please do not misunderstand the Empress. There is absolutely no illicit affair between this official and Her Majesty. If your majesty still does not believe it, then let my wife kneel for another 3 days and 3 nights to prove the innocence of the empress and myself. The emperor followed his gaze to me. Seeing my pale face and tear-stained cheeks, suspicion rose in his heart, and he asked, I saw Madame Li collapsed on the ground just now. What exactly happened here? Li Xingyan tried to speak up again, but with a single look from the emperor, 2 guards gagged him and pressed his face firmly against the ground. Seeing this, the Empress, despite the swollen handprint on her face, pouted and said, For the Emperor to treat an innocent man this way will surely damage his sacred reputation if word gets out. Release Imperial Physician Li at once. The Emperor ignored her, his gaze fixed solely on me. With suspicion and fury swirling in his eyes, he said in a low voice, Madame Li, whatever you know and whatever you have endured, speak freely. I will never allow an innocent person to suffer injustice in vain. I put on a grateful expression, but inwardly I sneered. His words were high-sounding and dignified, yet in reality, whenever it came to the Empress, this emperor acted as if he had lost his mind. When someone reported that Li Xingyan and the Empress were having an affair, the Empress merely claimed she had no way to defend herself against such accusations. To prove his innocence, Li Xingyan married me the very next day, and the emperor actually let the matter drop without another word. Someone reported that Li Xingyan spent the entire night in the Empress's palace, drinking and watching the moon together. Li Xingyan claimed it was because I admired the Empress and insisted on entering the palace to see her, and that he was only there to accompany me. To prove his innocence, Li Xingyan made me kneel outside the palace gates for 3 days and 3 nights. The emperor actually skipped over the matter entirely and never mentioned it again. On this day in my past life, I refused to hand over the jade bracelet no matter what. Li Xingyan punched and kicked me in front of a crowd of palace maids and eunuchs. The emperor arrived just as I was at death's door. Because I looked so wretched, the empress didn't immediately start acting jealous upon seeing the emperor. Instead, she stepped over me to establish her indifferent to fame and fortune persona, claiming I was vain and greedy. For a royal physician to beat his own wife until her leg was crippled right in the Empress's palace, the emperor actually skipped over the matter entirely and never mentioned it again. There were many other instances like this. With such a natural talent for skipping, the emperor would surely be a high jump or hurdling champion if he were reincarnated hundreds of years later. If I were to actually tell the truth, I fear the emperor and empress would only bicker for a few days before becoming lovey-dovey again, while I would merely become a prop in their play. Thank you for your concern, Your Majesty. It is merely that my leg injury has not yet healed and I simply lost my balance for a moment, I replied respectfully, bowing my head as low as possible. The emperor frowned, and as if suddenly recalling something, his gaze grew even colder. I remember now. You knelt outside the palace gates for 3 days and 3 nights to prove your husband's innocence. You are quite the devoted lover. If your leg injury hasn't healed, why have you entered the palace again? I hold the Empress in high esteem and have come specifically to present a pair of heirloom jade bracelets left to me by my parents to Her Majesty, lest such treasures be wasted in my possession, I answered quickly, speaking before the Empress could pout and utter another thoughtless remark. Oh. If that is the case, then you truly do revere the Empress. Very well, since your leg injury has not healed, you should return home early. It was clear that the Emperor's tone had relaxed significantly, and Li Xingyin, who had been struggling violently in the guard's grip to speak, finally quieted down. Only the Empress remained displeased, pouting as she spoke. Does your Majesty mean to say you still harbor suspicions toward me? I am as indifferent as a chrysanthemum, seeking neither fame nor conflict. But if your Majesty still does not believe me, you may send my personal maid, Lanxin, back to the Department of Punishment. Once she has endured 10,000 forms of torture and still maintains my innocence, your Majesty will know that I have never betrayed you, and Lanxin's heart as a loyal servant will be fulfilled. I could clearly feel Lanxin, who was supporting me, trembling uncontrollably. Fortunately, the Emperor had not witnessed any scandalous scenes during this visit, and with my indirect testimony to the Empress's innocence, he took her hand, his tone doting. Do you still not understand my feelings for you? I was simply too concerned about you, that is all. You, too, should work on tempering that temperament of yours. Upon hearing this, the Empress, whose face was so swollen from the slap that half of it resembled a pig's head, still lifted her chin triumphantly. Her 2 crooked, worm-like eyebrows arched haughtily. I admire the integrity of the plum blossom. I would rather remain unyielding and proud amidst the bitter cold, just like the plum. Just a moment ago, she was as indifferent and serene as a chrysanthemum, and now she claims to love plum blossoms. She tries to drape every noble quality over herself. With the Emperor's dismissal, I was finally able to go home. However, since Li Xingyin still had to remain on duty in the palace, it was Lanxin who escorted me out. Lanxin and I could be considered fellow sufferers. She is stuck with a wretched mistress who pushes her forward to take the blame whenever something goes wrong, while I am stuck with a wretched husband who does the exact same to me. Last time, when Yang Yuchen and Li Xingyin were reported for their all-night conversation, Lanxin was sent to the Department of Punishment by Yang Yuchen for 3 days and nights. Meanwhile, I was ordered by Li Xingyin to kneel outside the palace gates for 3 days and nights. All things considered, her injuries were even more severe than mine. I was not beaten today, though my knees ache faintly. I will not be left disabled in this lifetime. Lanxin, however, had her leg intentionally broken in the Department of Punishment by concubines who held a grudge against Yang Yuchen. She was left with a permanent disability, walking with a noticeable limp. As we approached the palace gates, I pulled Lanxin aside and took a palm-sized medicine box from my sleeve, pressing it into her hand. Miss Lanxin, observing the way you walk, it seems you haven't had much medicine or rest. This isn't anything fancy and isn't worth much, but it should help at least a little. Please don't refuse it. Looking at you, I feel as if I am seeing another version of myself. As I spoke, my eyes welled up with tears. This part was not an act. Lanxin froze for a moment, her own eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Her hand tightened, gripping the small medicine box firmly. Upon returning home and looking at the empty, shabby house, I couldn't help but let out a cold sneer. By all rights, as a physician deeply trusted by the Empress, Li Xingyin should have earned more than enough to support his family. However, as Lanxin's plight demonstrated, being favored by Yang Yuchen was by no means a blessing. Yang Yuchen was the successor Empress. The late Empress had championed frugality and led by example, and her virtue is still praised to this day. Because the Emperor wrote a poem mourning his late wife, Yang Yuchen, in a fit of pique, decided she would be frugal as well. However, her version of frugality never involved self-sacrifice. Instead, she docked the allowances of others. Since most of the concubines came from noble families she dared not provoke, she targeted the salaries of the palace maids and eunuchs. For a time, grievances filled the air. When concubines from other palaces complained to the emperor, he reprimanded Yang Yuchen for her erratic management and restored the salaries of the servants across the palace. Refusing to back down, Yang Yuchen insisted on continuing the cuts for the servants in her own palace. Upon hearing this, Li Xingyin, wishing to demonstrate his support for her, voluntarily requested to forego his salary and even offered to pay a monthly stipend back to the palace. Deeply moved, Yang Yuchen agreed. From then on, not a single cent of Li Xingyin's palace salary ever made it home. It was all handed directly to Yang Yuchen. He even had to provide her with an additional 50 taels of silver every month. Those 50 taels were earned by me, slipping away while Li Xingyin was out to dig for medicinal herbs on the mountains and traveling far and wide to practice medicine. All the silver I had earned through my hard work had been transformed into the magnificent jewelry on Yang Yuchen's body and the hideous nail guards on her hands. The mere thought of it made me seethe with anger, but then, remembering the jade bracelet worn on her wrist, I smiled again. Yang Yuchen certainly had a sharp eye. The jade bracelet, manifested through the divine magic of the Earth Mother, was naturally a rare treasure. However, this treasure was intended to monitor my repayment of a debt of gratitude. I am not human. I am a snake demon personally enlightened by the Earth Mother. 1,000 years ago, a scholar used a stone to drive away an eagle that was about to snatch me from a stream. 1,000 years later, the Earth Mother personally enlightened me, telling me that I was only one act of gratitude away from achieving immortality. She then helped me find the scholar's reincarnation, Li Xingyin. In reality, however, I had already hidden in a crevice between the rocks in the stream, and the eagle wouldn't have been able to catch me anyway. The scholar's intervention was entirely unnecessary. I was indignant, but the heavenly Tao cares for none of that. Thus, I was forced to carry a debt of gratitude that had to be repaid. Because I was so reluctant, the Earth Mother cast a spell to transform into a pair of jade bracelets on my wrists that suppressed my magical powers. She told me that while wearing them, if I did not properly repay my debt to Li Xingyin, my karmic blessings would be diminished. Furthermore, only Li Xingyin could remove them. Now, the bracelets are on Yang Yuchen's wrists. Given her temperament, repaying a debt is out of the question. I'm curious to see what the consequences of losing one's karmic blessings will be. To witness Yang Yuchen's downfall, I cannot abandon Li Xingyin just yet. Therefore, I prepared a meal at home and waited for him to return. Is this all you made? Li Xingyin looked at the bowl of porridge, so thin you could barely see a few grains of rice, and a plate of bland, tasteless wild greens, frowning in disgust. I feigned innocence. Husband, there is no money left in the house. The rice jar is nearly empty, and I had to work hard just to find these wild greens. I originally intended to sell the jade bracelet my parents left me for some money, but now. I didn't finish my sentence, but Li Xingyin naturally understood my meaning. After all, he was the one who personally took the jade bracelet off my wrist and placed it onto Yang Yuchen's. At the mention of Yang Yuchen, Li Xingyin stopped picking a fight. He picked up the bowl and took a sip of the porridge, then lifted a chopstick full of wild greens into his mouth, his brow furrowing so deeply it could have crushed a fly. How could he not be disgusted? Previously, I had changed the menu every day to cook him lavish meals of fish and meat, terrified that he might eat poorly, all in the hopes of repaying his kindness sooner. Now that the jade bracelet is no longer in my possession, I used the last of the rice to cook myself a bowl of fragrant white rice and spent the final bit of money on a delicious roasted chicken, devouring every bit. I only used the few stray grains of rice found in the crevices of the jar to boil a large pot of watery rice soup for Li Xingyin, and the wild greens were just something I had casually plucked with fire tongs from beside the latrine. After only 2 bites, Li Xingyin set down his bowl and chopsticks, looking at me with an unfriendly gaze. Whereas all the money in this house gone? How exactly are you managing this household? Husband, ever since I arrived in this home, every expense for food, clothing, housing, and travel has been paid for out of my own savings. You have never handed over even a single cent of your salary to me. Instead, you demand 50 taels of silver from me every month for unknown purposes. The meager inheritance my parents left me has been completely exhausted. After speaking loudly, I began to weep. Li Xingyan's expression darkened further as he looked outside nervously. Since we hadn't lit the oil lamps today, he was eating in the courtyard by the light of the moon. This house of his was very crude with poor soundproofing. One could currently hear the neighbors on both sides chatting in their yards. Correspondingly, the neighbors could naturally hear my tearful complaints. "Keep your voice down. Stop talking." Noticing that the neighbors on both sides had instantly fallen silent from their laughter and chatter, Li Xingyan glared at me. Ignoring him entirely, I continued my tearful lament. "Husband, there is neither money nor grain left in the house, and I am at my wit's end. The rice porridge and wild greens in the kitchen pot are the best I could manage. From this day forth, I shall not eat. Let us prioritize your sustenance first." Leaving him with those words, I hurried back to my room sobbing, terrified that if I stayed a moment longer, I wouldn't be able to hold back my laughter. Li Xingyan and I do not sleep together. Every night, he sleeps in another room clutching the boots Yang Yuchen made for him. This made it convenient for me to enjoy my food in secret. Without the restraint of the jade bracelet, my magic had returned. As I listened to the sound of Li Xingyan's stomach growling with hunger and his restless tossing and turning next door, the pastries in my mouth tasted even more delicious. For several days straight, I hid in my room whenever Li Xingyan returned. When he was out, I would go out to play, only to return home near dusk, sluggishly walking through the alley carrying a basket of messy wild herbs, chatting with the neighbors with a face full of sorrow. Finally, one day, Li Xingyan could no longer bear it. He came to knock on my door and said in a humble, pleading tone, "Xiao Hei, could you please explain to the neighbors that I have not been mistreating you? Being a black snake puts one at a disadvantage when it comes to naming. Xiao Qing or Xiao Bai sound like they belong to beauties, but Xiao Hei just sounds unattractive. In reality, I am quite beautiful." Li Xingyan's voice faltered as he spoke. I opened the door to see that his cheeks had already begun to sink slightly. I feigned heartache and said, "Husband, it doesn't matter what happens to me, but you've become so thin. Tomorrow is payday. Please bring some money back. It doesn't have to be much, just enough for me to buy some meat to cook a meal and nourish your body." Li Xingyan's expression shifted as he wavered. Finally, after his stomach let out another loud growl, he made up his mind and nodded. He hadn't had a full meal in days. While on duty at the Imperial Academy of Medicine, his stomach would often rumble so loudly it drew ridicule, forcing him to laugh it off as a digestive ailment. If he couldn't get a decent meal and remained dizzy with hunger, how could he possibly serve as the Empress's most capable physician? The next day, as I expected, Li Xingyan returned with a dark expression, not breathing a word about the money. Yang Yuchen claimed to practice frugality, but it was nothing more than a poor imitation. The late Empress had truly led by example, proposing practical and feasible austerity measures that naturally earned the respect of her subordinates. Yang Yuchen, however, lived in luxury while forcing those beneath her to eat husks and wild herbs. Once Li Xingyan's salary entered her pocket, there was no way she would spit it back out. If anything, she would likely blame him for failing to hand over the 50 taels of silver on time. Such biting the hand that feeds them, now this is going to be a good show. When news arrived that Li Xingyan had collapsed in the palace, I was chatting with a neighbor auntie while carrying wild vegetables. Upon hearing the news, I followed the young eunuch messenger to the palace with feigned impatience. Behind me, the neighbor auntie shook her head and sighed, "What a fine girl, yet she ended up with such a heartless man. All that sincerity has been thrown to the dogs." I was indeed sincere, only, I wasn't sincerely worried about Li Xingyan. I was sincerely worried about missing the spectacle. Following behind the little eunuch, I wasn't at all surprised to see that our destination was the Empress's palace. Physician Li suddenly fainted while performing the Empress's routine health check. Her Majesty allowed him to rest in the palace and even summoned Physician Zhao to examine him. "The Emperor is there as well," Lan Qin whispered to me. Watching her walk, she still had a slight limp, though she was doing much better than last time. Before even stepping into the room, I heard the Emperor's voice filled with disbelief. "Fainted from hunger? How can this be? Could it be that the palace is actually withholding the physician's salaries?" Your Majesty, that is surely impossible. Clutching the wild greens, I dashed inside, cutting off Yang Yuchen mid-sentence. I threw myself onto the unconscious Li Xingyan, wailing mournfully, "Husband. What has happened to you, husband? I've been working so hard to find wild greens, husband, please wake up." If the imperial physicians were facing financial hardship, there was no guarantee they wouldn't harbor ill intentions that could jeopardize safety. The emperor looked at the basket in my hand, his expression growing even more solemn. "Madam Li, exactly what kind of difficulties has your household encountered?" Feigning total ignorance of the fact that Li Xingyan had been handing his salary over to Yang Yuchen, I revealed that he had never brought a single cent home. Instead, he had been demanding 50 taels of silver from me every month. I also made sure to mention how, on the day before payday, he had promised to bring his salary home only to return with a dark, sullen face. Yang Yuchen tried to interrupt several times but failed. Finally, as soon as I finished speaking, she said with an air of lofty virtue, "It must be that Madame Li is unskilled in managing a household, which is why Physician Li has been driven to such straits. Surely his money was spent on more important matters. Your Majesty, please allow me to handle this affair." The emperor did not skip over it as he had done previously, but instead directly commanded the eunuch by his side, "Order someone to summon the officials from the imperial household department responsible for distributing stipends. Today, I shall see for myself whether Physician Li actually received his pay." Yang Yuchen's expression stiffened, a flash of panic crossing her eyes. However, she quickly devised a countermeasure, standing up and pointing at the emperor with fingers adorned in ornate nail guards. "Does your Majesty not trust me? I am the Empress. Managing these affairs is my duty. By acting this way, your Majesty is slapping my face. I am willing to request exile to the cold palace until your Majesty believes me." Everyone looked at Yang Yuchen in bewilderment, and the emperor was even more perplexed. "Since when did you take charge of the physician's stipends?" Just then, the chief of the imperial household department arrived, leading the head eunuch in charge of distributing stipends. The head eunuch, unaware of the underlying reasons, answered the emperor's inquiry honestly. "Previously, to support the empress's policy of frugality, imperial physician Li requested to waive his salary. The palace maids from the empress's quarters have been collecting it instead. This month, imperial physician Li did come to claim it, but after seeking instructions from the empress, she refused, so it was not given to him. As for the 50 taels of silver per month, there are rumors in the palace that he gives 50 taels to the empress every month. As to whether this is true or false, this servant does not know." Yang Yuchen knelt on the ground in a panic. Seeing Lanqin, her eyes suddenly lit up, and she pointed at her, shouting, "It was all her. Your Majesty!" It was Lanqin who swallowed imperial physician Li's silver. "I knew nothing about it. Lanqin did everything." The emperor's face was grim. I watched him cautiously out of the corner of my eye, feeling that something was amiss. Upon careful reflection, it seemed that compared to my previous life, or even our last meeting, the deep affection for Yang Yuchen in the emperor's eyes had diminished significantly. Could it be that because Yang Yuchen refused to give Li Xingyan his salary, the jade bracelet deemed it a failure to repay a kindness, and her karmic blessings were truly being depleted? Lanqin was shaking like a sieve, terrified to death. She knew full well that since the emperor was personally intervening, this matter would not be easily overlooked. Her lips trembled as she tried to find a way to defend herself. Yang Yuchen looked at her and said word by word, "We have been mistress and servant for a long time, and I believe I have treated you well. If you confess your guilt now, I will beg the emperor to grant you a swift death, which shall serve as the final fulfillment of our bond." Seeing the flash of despair in Lanqin's eyes, I cowed out heavily and said through tears, "Your Majesty, one need only investigate who has spent extra silver, and the truth will naturally come to light. If it truly was my husband who gave it to Lanqin, then I am incompetent for failing to hold my husband's heart, and I request to be divorced and leave the household." By elevating the matter to the level of a private affair, the emperor's face darkened even further. He slammed his hand on the table and ordered a search of the palace. Naturally, nothing was found in Lanqin's quarters. In fact, her room was so shabbily furnished that it didn't look like the residence of the Empress's handmaid at all. A salary pouch labeled with Li Xing'an's name was discovered in Yang Yuchen's palace, along with an account book filled with records of the silver she had embezzled from palace maids, eunuchs, and Li Xing'an during this period. Seeing this, the crowd of maids and eunuchs from the Empress's palace, who had long suffered in silence from her extortions, knelt outside in unison, pleading for the emperor to grant them justice. "What else do you have to say for yourself?" The emperor hurled the account book directly at Yang Yuchen's face. With the evidence as solid as a mountain, Yang Yuchen straightened her back and lifted her chin. Just as she had done during previous interrogations, she maintained a haughty air and pouted, saying, "If your majesty does not believe me, then no amount of explanation will suffice. I request to enter the cold palace myself until your majesty believes in my innocence." Previously, at this stage, the emperor would have helped Yang Yuchen up and let the matter slide. But this time, his eyes were icy and his voice flat as he declared, "Very well. The Empress is of poor character. She has mistreated palace staff, wantonly amassed wealth, and brought depravity to the inner palace. Effective immediately, she is banished to the cold palace, not to leave without an imperial decree." Yang Yuchen's face was filled with utter disbelief, her panic making it impossible to maintain her facade of being as indifferent as a chrysanthemum. She grabbed the emperor's leg, her nail guards nearly piercing through his trousers into his flesh, her raspy voice cracking as she shrieked, "Your Majesty, we were childhood sweethearts. I never asked to be this empress. It was you who insisted I come, so I came. How can you treat me like this now?" The emperor kicked Yang Yuchen away impatiently, his eyes filled with a mix of vacancy and confusion. "I misjudged you back then. I never knew you were such a venomous woman. Since you do not wish to be empress, I shall grant your wish and depose you." In her previous life, Yang Yuchen had also been sent to the cold palace, though that time she had been framed by other concubines. She had remained unscathed there, but Lanqin, whom she had brought along to work like a beast of burden, had died within its walls. Unable to bear the thought, I took advantage of the fact that the emperor had not yet left and kowtowed once more. "Your Majesty, if I may be so bold, Miss Lanqin bears a striking resemblance to my long-lost elder sister, and seeing her treated so harshly by the Empress truly breaks my heart. I have heard that Miss Lanqin has reached the age to leave the palace. I beg your Majesty to allow her to return home with me." The emperor, currently in a state of agitation, glanced at Lanqin and me before saying dismissively, "The two of you do indeed share some resemblance. If Lanqin is willing to leave the palace, then let her go with Madame Li." Lanqin was so moved that her eyes filled with tears of joy, and she kowtowed repeatedly to express her gratitude. However, a sharp scream suddenly rang out from beside her. It was Yang Yuchen. "No! If Lanqin leaves, who will come with me to the cold palace to serve me? You venomous woman! Do you think entering the cold palace is for your enjoyment? You still expect someone to wait on you. Men, watch her closely. The deposed empress is forbidden from bringing any gold or silver into the cold palace. If anyone dares to disobey, they shall join her there." The emperor kicked Yang Yuchen once more, sending her sprawling. Her hair became a disheveled mess, and her jewelry scattered all over the floor. "Strip her of her finery and remove every piece of jewelry from her body this instant. Send her to the cold palace immediately." The emperor's eyes were stung by the sight of the magnificent jewels. Thinking of the ledgers filled with embezzled funds and the lingering pain in his leg where Yang Yuchen had scratched him with her nail guards, his expression grew even more ruthless. "No! My clothes! You lowly wenches, this garment was woven by 100 seamstresses working day and night for 3 months. My nail guards! You are not allowed to pull off my nail guards. Even if I am sent to the cold palace, I will maintain my dignity. Ah! Who is pulling my hair?" The palace servants ordered forward were all those who had been mistreated by the Empress. Seizing the opportunity to take their revenge, they set upon her until Yang Yuchen's continuous screams actually jolted Li Xing'an awake. Li Xing'an looked completely dazed. He instinctively rushed forward to protect young Yuchen, but due to his physical weakness and trembling legs, he collapsed to the ground in a fit of helpless rage. Let go of Her Majesty. The Empress is of noble status, how could you treat her like this? I thoughtfully leaned in to tell Li Xingyan what had happened. At that moment, young Yuchen also noticed that Li Xingyan was awake. Her eyes lit up, and she desperately pushed the palace attendants aside, rushing over to grab Li Xingyan. Tell the emperor quickly that you gave me that money voluntarily, I didn't ask for it. I cannot be deposed. I am the most honorable empress. Li Xingyan's expression flickered with struggle, but he finally made up his mind. He knelt before the emperor, ignoring the emperor's grim face, and said, Your Majesty, that money was all voluntarily offered by this subject to Her Majesty. The Empress comes from a noble background, so naturally she has many expenses. If Your Majesty wishes to assign blame. Midway through his sentence, Li Xingyan looked at me and said with an air of self-righteousness, If Your Majesty wishes to assign blame, it is all because my wife failed to manage the household properly, leaving me with nothing to eat, which led to this great disaster. I beg Your Majesty not to misunderstand the Empress. Let my wife enter the cold palace in the Empress's stead. My eyes were merely brimming with tears, and I uttered no word of refusal. The emperor did not immediately dismiss his claim, but instead asked in a gentle tone, Your wife spent all the savings left by her parents to manage the household, and gave you 50 taels every month so you could curry favor with the Empress. Even when she had no money, she searched for wild herbs every day just to prepare food for you. Do you still believe it was your wife's poor management that caused all this, and that she should enter the cold palace in the Empress's stead? Young Yuchen spoke up first, saying, The cold palace is merely a place where life is a bit harder. It certainly won't cause her serious injury or death. She just needs to endure it for a while. The emperor looked only at Li Xingyan, who said without a moment's hesitation, Her Majesty the Empress is correct. My wife is lowly by nature and cannot be compared to the nobility of Her Majesty. It is her good fortune to be able to enter the cold palace in Her Majesty's place. The emperor sneered, a vain and poisonous woman, and a heartless, ungrateful beast. Guards! Drag imperial physician Li away, sentence him to castration, and demote him to a eunuch. Send him to guard the cold palace to fulfill his loyalty to the deposed empress. What? No, this can't be. Your Majesty, punish my wife instead, please don't. Li Xingyan, his face twisted in terror, was dragged into the distance. The emperor granted me a divorce from Li Xingyan, but I refused. Regardless of everything, my husband once saved my life. Though he has been heartless, I cannot be unrighteous. I beg Your Majesty to allow me to enter the palace occasionally to bring him hand-sewn clothes and shoes as a way to repay his kindness. I knelt before the emperor, my words filled with earnest sincerity. I certainly had no genuine feelings for Li Xingyan. I simply wanted to see if offering help in his time of need could be counted as repaying a debt of gratitude. The emperor let out a long sigh, scrutinized my face once more, and said, looking closely, Madam Li does bear some resemblance to the deposed empress, yet your hearts are vastly different. Very well, I grant your request. In a flash of insight, I finally understood why, in my previous life, young Yuchen had inexplicably told Li Xingyan that she disliked my face. It was that comment that led Li Xingyan to slash me with knives, scald me with boiling water, and parade my disfigured self through the streets every day. Surely, in my past life, the emperor must have said those same words when I wasn't aware. After all, the emperor had seen me quite often back then, using me as a convenient distraction. The emperor also said that I bore some resemblance to her ladyship. From then on, she constantly pushed me into danger, always claiming it was to honor the bond between master and servant, Lanqin said with a bleak, self-mocking smile upon hearing me mention the emperor's words. I held the newly purchased fabric up against her to measure, correcting her solemnly, Sister Lanqin, you are no longer a palace maid. There is no need to refer to yourself as your servant anymore. Hearing this, Lanqin froze for a moment, and then tears welled up in her eyes. Xiaohei, I know you only said those things because you wanted to get me out of the palace, but I truly have no way to repay your great kindness. Can I stay with you? It wasn't entirely a lie. When I saw you, I really did feel an instant connection. Since Li Xingyan will be in the palace from now on, it would be even better to have you keeping me company. I took Lanqin's hand and gestured to the fabric shop owner. All of these, I want them all. Make several sets of trendy clothes according to her measurements. Using the leftover scraps from making Lanqin's clothes, I sewed 2 garments covered in patches and went into the palace to visit Li Xingyan. The cold palace was desolate. Li Xingyan was huddled in a corner of the palace gate, looking utterly wretched. As I drew closer, a foul odor wafted from him. I immediately took 2 steps back to maintain my distance, while maintaining a facade of deep concern. Husband, how have you been in the palace? I've brought you a couple of changes of clothes. Xiao Hei. It's you. Please, plead with the emperor for me. I don't want to stay in the cold palace, I don't want to be a eunuch, I want to continue being an imperial physician. Upon hearing my voice, Li Xingyan looked up and rushed toward me, trying to grab my hand. Quick as a flash, I thrust the bundle of clothes toward him to block his reach, my expression filled with sorrow. Husband, if I were capable of that, how could I have let you fall to such a state? I have already petitioned His Majesty not to grant a divorce, so that I may occasionally bring you supplies. Beyond that, there is nothing more I can do. Bring me things? Where is Lanqin? Has that wretched slave not come to bring this palace anything? A raspy, aged voice drifted from the corner. Only then did I realize that the spot where Li Xingyan had been crouching featured a small window. A pair of eyebrows like wriggling earthworms and slanted eyes were squeezing toward the opening. It was young Yuchen's face. As it turned out, the 2 of them had been chatting through the window just now. I remained silent. Li Xingyan, finally realizing he needed to get back in my good graces, stammered an explanation. Xiao Hei, Her Majesty the Empress and I were just talking. There's nothing else going on. Why bother explaining to her? A vulgar commoner could never understand the preciousness of a soulmate's bond, young Yuchen said with a disdainful tone. She reached a short, thick hand through the small window. Give me the clothes to look at. I've ruined several pieces washing them here in the cold palace and I'm almost out of things to wear. It's all because of that traitorous wench Lan Xin. If she had volunteered to follow me into the cold palace, I wouldn't be suffering like this. Li Xingyan hesitated, however, clutching the bundle tightly as he caught the scent of food coming from inside. Young Yuchen's hand hovered for a long while, but he still refused. Life in the palace is difficult for me. Xiao Hei gave this to me. Young Yuchen flew into a rage and cursed, You are nothing but the grandson of my family's horse slave. If I hadn't been kind enough to give you a medical book back then, how could you have ever entered the palace to become an imperial physician? Li Xingyan remained silent, merely pulling a coarse flour-steamed bun from his bundle and devouring it ravenously. The jade bracelet had been away from me for long enough that the influence of the mother goddess's power had completely vanished. Now, I could see 2 types of threads, one black and one red, extending from the jade bracelet on young Yuchen's outstretched wrist. The other ends of these threads were both connected to Li Xingyan. The red thread, representing gratitude, was so faint it was almost invisible, while the black thread, representing backlash, clawed the air aggressively, emitting a dense and ominous light. Hey, next time bring more clothes, food, and armor. Even in the cold palace, one must live with dignity. Also, send word to Lanqin. Tell her to take the initiative to petition the emperor to come in and serve me, young Yuchen said, watching Li Xingyan devour the food. She was salivating heavily, yet she still spoke to me in a condescending tone. I merely looked at Li Xingyan with hesitation, acting as if I deferred entirely to him. Husband, because of what happened before, there's no money left at home. I only managed to buy these things with the money I earned from doing needlework for others. I really have no way to provide what the Empress asks for. As for Miss Lanqin, I'm afraid that if I anger His Majesty, I won't even be able to come and bring you things occasionally. She's just a deposed Empress, why bother with her? Don't listen to her. You are my wife. It's enough that you bring things for me, Li Xingyan said bluntly, as if he had finally seen sense. As I reached the corner of the palace wall, I glanced back and saw Li Xingyan land a heavy punch on Yang Yuchen's face as she pressed it against the small window. With that blow, the glow of the black thread dimmed imperceptibly. It seems Yang Yuchen has some grueling days ahead of her. After I started living with Lanqin, I discovered she was incredibly capable, skilled enough to go hunting in the mountains and equally adept at cooking at home. It's no wonder Yang Yuchen both hated her and couldn't live without her. Even I've grown plump from her cooking. On my 5th visit to the palace to deliver items to Li Xingyan, I noticed that Yang Yuchen had lost an eye and Li Xingyan was missing a section of a finger. The red thread between them had vanished, replaced only by black threads. Unfortunately, no one can see the threads on their own body. Thus, I couldn't see the thread between myself and Li Xingyan. I had no idea if my debt of gratitude had been repaid. I feared that his castration and banishment to the coal palace bore my traces, and that instead of repaying the favor, I had diminished my own karmic rewards. Xiao Hei, is there some kind of mechanism in this jade bracelet? Why is it that once I put it on that wretched woman, it can't be taken off? Life in the palace is truly miserable, and our stipends have been completely embezzled. I was hoping to trade that bracelet for some money, Li Xingyan said to me. I simply put on a dazed expression, I don't know. Didn't you help me take it off when I wore it, husband? Could it be because I was willing, but Her Majesty the Queen is not? Li Xingyan looked thoughtful. Yang Yuchen, squeezed against the small window, heard this as well. Her face was filled with terror as she lashed out, cursing, "You bitch, you're behind this. Why did you give the bracelet to me? Why won't it come off? You should be a cripple. Li Xingyan, break her legs. You bitch. I'm going to slash your face. I'll scald your face with boiling water until it's covered in blisters so everyone can see how ugly you are. Why didn't you die for me? Why? I am the queen. Why is it different? Why?" From her words, I discovered something interesting. But this is even better. Before I could enter the palace again, Li Xingyan was sentenced to death. In order to take the bracelets and sell them for money, Li Xingyan hacked off Yang Yuchen's hands. To his surprise, once the hands were severed, the jade bracelets vanished. Li Xingyan went mad and hacked Yang Yuchen to death in a frenzy. The emperor showed mercy and allowed me to see Li Xingyan one last time. Xiao Hei, was it because of the jade bracelets? Was it you who changed all of this? Li Xingyan was unexpectedly calm. I knew then that he hadn't gone mad, but had finally woken up. I feigned ignorance, squeezing out a few tears. "Husband, what are you saying? Why would you kill the Empress? You must have had your reasons, right? Please, say something, perhaps His Majesty will show mercy." Li Xingyan studied me expressionlessly for a long time. It wasn't until the jailer came to urge him along that he finally broke into a smile, looking as if he had found peace. He said in a gentle tone, "Xiao Hei, I have wronged you. If we are fated to meet in the next life, I will surely live a good life with you." On the day of the execution, I made a point of standing in the front row of the crowd. As the executioner wiped his blade, I mouthed to Li Xingyan as he looked toward me, "The jade bracelet, I did it on purpose." Li Xingyan's eyes widened, his face a twisted, complex mess of fury, hatred, and disbelief. That expression was finally severed by the heavy blade, frozen forever. The jade bracelet was gone, Li Xingyan was dead, and the Earth Mother Goddess hadn't contacted me. So, I settled down and lived a quiet life with Lanqin. Until one day, before heading up the mountain to hunt, Lanqin suddenly pulled out a small, solid gold longevity lock. She placed it in my palm and said with a crescent moon smile, "A birthday gift for you." For some reason, I just felt like giving it to you early. Not long after Lanqin left, I sat at home clutching the heavy gold lock, my eyelids twitching incessantly. Just as I couldn't take it anymore and was about to head up the mountain to find her, the Earth Mother Goddess appeared. "Xiao Hei, not bad at all. You've successfully completed your repayment. If you'd done this from the start, why would you have needed to die once? The Earth Mother Goddess patted my head, her smile bright and hearty. I stood there dazed. Huh? How was it completed? Didn't he reincarnate a long time ago? The Earth Mother was also stunned. She conjured a ledger out of thin air, flipping through it with a loud rustling sound until she finally stopped at a shimmering golden page. That's not right, she said. It was just completed. The golden dragon has successfully reincarnated. The Earth Mother and I spent a long time reconciling the accounts before finally figuring it out. The one I was supposed to repay was not the scholar from 1,000 years ago at all, but the eagle from 1,000 years ago. The scholar had intended to scare me out with a stone to catch me. It was that eagle who drove the scholar away and saved my life. It was true that Li Xingyan was the reincarnation of the scholar, but he owed me no debt of gratitude. Lan Xian, the reincarnation of the eagle, was my true benefactor. Originally, after Lan Xin's death, she was meant to be reincarnated into the womb of the favored consort. Even without my repayment of the debt, she would have become the next emperor. Unexpectedly, because of my interference, Yang Yechen and Li Xingyan were able to escape danger repeatedly, giving them the chance to join forces and cause the favored consort's miscarriage. Consequently, my previous attempt to repay the debt failed and instead led to a great disaster, prompting the Earth Mother Goddess to restart the cycle of reincarnation. Oh dear, all those snake demons before you had humans as the objects of their gratitude. My mistake, I was too quick to judge. However, you've actually turned a misfortune into a blessing. That is the blessing of a golden dragon, after all. The Earth Mother Goddess looked at the longevity lock in my palm, smiling as she patted my head once more. Reincarnation, changes in species, and changes in gender are all quite normal. Thus, an eagle becoming a golden dragon becoming Lan Xin, and Lan Xin becoming the little prince, it is all perfectly normal. With a glittering golden chain wrapped around my snake body and a longevity lock dangling from it, I swayed and slithered onto the little prince's cradle, tilting my head to observe the benefactor who would allow me to achieve immortality. One could still vaguely see traces of Lan Xin in his features. I then looked at the doting imperial concubine beside him. Well, it turns out the emperor simply has a preference for women with this kind of look, which is hardly surprising. Taking advantage of the fact that no one could see me, I flicked the tip of my tail to tease the little prince. He grabbed it with a firm grip, giggling uncontrollably, before I easily slipped it away. During the one-year-old Zhuazhou ceremony, the little prince grabbed a handful of empty air. The historical records claim it was an auspicious aura radiating golden light, which isn't technically wrong. I was draped in gold chains and wearing a gold lock, so how could I not be radiating golden light? It was just that ordinary people couldn't see me. Being an immortal is actually quite boring. I occasionally go out to do some good deeds, but most of the time I stay by the little prince's side. When no one else is around, he talks to me, asking all sorts of bizarre questions, and even asks me with a beaming smile if I can lay eggs. I can turn into a snake, I can turn into a human, I can be male, and I can be female. As for whether I can lay eggs, I really don't know. I vaguely remember that I seemed to be a male snake at the very beginning, but later, because I had to repay Li Xingyan's kindness, and the seniors all said that the way to repay a debt of gratitude was to offer oneself in marriage, I transformed into a woman. Probably not. The little prince grew into the eldest prince, and the eldest prince became the emperor. However, he never married and instead brought a child back to the palace to raise. And so, I watched the new little prince become the eldest prince, and the eldest prince become the emperor once more, only he could not see me. The golden dragon has completed his tribulation and attained full merit. He will no longer be reincarnated, nor will he change form again. He is, naturally, a male dragon. It's a bit of a pity that neither of us can lay eggs. But it doesn't matter. We have no throne to inherit. Hunting and doing good deeds is plenty of fun. I have only one piece of advice: when repaying a debt of gratitude, make sure you identify the right person. The story ends here. Thank you all for your company, and see you in the next one.